God bless. I want to give an honor to God, who is the head over my life. God has sent me to the chapter of this word that I'm going to bring forth to the people of God. Go with me to Acts 23, verses 12 through 22. The subject is going to be the plot to kill Paul. The next morning, some Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. More than 40 men were involved in this plot. They went to the chief priests and the elders and said, "We have taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we have killed Paul. Now then, you and the Sanhedrin petitioned the commander to bring him before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about his case. We are ready to kill him before he gets here." But when the son of Paul's sister heard of this plot, he went into the barracks and told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take the young man to the commander. He has something to tell him." So he took him to the commander. The centurion said to Paul, "The prisoner sent for me and asked me to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you." The commander took the young man by the hand, drew him aside, and he said, "Some Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about him. Don't give in to them because more than 40 of them are waiting in ambush for him. They have taken an oath not to eat or drink until they have killed him. They are ready now, waiting for your consent to their request." The commander dismissed the young man with a warning. "Don't tell anyone that you have this report, this that you have reported this to me." Okay, so let's go back into this reading. Ooh. When the Pharisees died down, the religious leaders refocused their attention on Paul. To these leaders, politics and position had become more important than God. They were ready to plan another murder, just as they had done with Jesus. But as always, God was in control. Young people and children can often be overlooked when adults assume they aren't old enough to do much for the Lord. But this young man played an important part in protecting Paul's life. Paul trusted him, and the God listened. God can use anyone of any age who is willing to yield to him. Paul wrote, "Don't let anyone look down on you because you are young, but set an example for the believers." You can read that in Timothy 1, 4 through 12. Paul's nephew expedited confidence, urgency, respect, and he saved Paul's life. Earlier, Jesus had made it clear that children are important. Go to Matthew 18, 2 and 6. Give children the importance God gives them. This is why my biblical reference to Paul's family, some interpret believers that Paul's family had disowned him when he became a follower of Jesus. Paul wrote of having suffering loss of everything for Christ. You can read that in Philippians 3 and 8. So this is indeed possibility in any case. His nephew still cared about him and was able to see him even though Paul was in protective custody, because Roman prisoners were accessible to their relatives and friends who were allowed to bring them food or other amenities. In this, Paul was doing a work for God, but he was getting tormented for his work, just like Jesus did. How many know that when you hold a cross for Jesus, that just know there's going to be bloodshed behind it because of what you believe or who you follow. And this is what Paul was doing. But it was a bunch of leaders. They were fasting. They were fasting. They wouldn't eat or drink because their fasting was to take Paul down. And here it talks about the plot to kill Paul. There was a conspiracy bound themselves with an oath. They had an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. More than 40 men were involved in this plot. They went to the chief priests and the elders and said, "We have taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we have killed Paul. Before you, on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about this case, we are ready to kill him before he gets here." But when the son of Paul's sister heard of this plot, he went into Barak and told Paul. This is how good God is, okay? It could be 100 people plotting against you, but the plot never works because God is in control. So in this, Paul never knew about the plot that was against him. All he knew that there were a bunch of leaders that were fasting. He didn't know why they were fasting. But people were coming back to Paul that wasn't supposed to tell Paul about the report that was going on. But there was a prisoner that told Paul, there are leaders that are not eating or drinking because they made an oath for you to die. But the oath did not stand because God was in the midst. God was in the midst of the plan, of the plot that was happening, and it didn't work. See, in the midst of all of this, in the midst of all this work Paul was doing for the Lord, it was religious leaders. They refocused their attention on Paul. They didn't care about no gospel. They didn't care about no Bible. They didn't care about being teachers. Their teaching was about Paul. To these leaders, political positions have become more important than God. So to these particular leaders, they didn't care about the importance of God anymore. They just wanted to know how could they get up the rank of making more money. They had become more important than God. What could be more important than God? He gave you the position that you have with his anointing. He can take it back. They were ready to plan another murder, just as they had done with Jesus. It was Jesus' own religious leaders that brought him to the cross. Some people think it was the people that laid Jesus to the cross, the people he was healing that laid Jesus to the cross. But it wasn't. It was his own religious leaders that brought him to the cross. But as always, God was in control. All the fasting they were doing, all the praying they were doing, and God said, you can't take Paul, because Paul has a seal. And the only way you can break that seal is by going through me. In these religious leaders, they were intimidated by Paul. They didn't know where he got his spiritual gifts. So they said, you know what? We're going to kill Paul, because he's making us as leaders look bad. So what they did was to Paul, they said, hey, let's go on a 20-day fast. Let's go on a 31-day fast. Let's don't eat, don't drink. Because our oath is to kill Paul. It was more than 40 leaders that were doing this to kill Paul. But God said, I'm always in control. And I see what you're doing. But you won't even be able to touch Paul. Go to Acts 23, verses 12 through 22. God bless.